All right, going to get things going here, guys. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Mandeville. I'm the Executive Director for the Lamoille Economic Development Corporation. If you don't know what that is, there are 12 things called RDCs, Regional Development Corporations, in the state, and each of them is responsible for a particular region. Obviously, the one I'm responsible for is Lamoille County. And we, at its most basic, what our responsibility is to do everything we can to support all efforts for job creation and job retention, and to help companies be healthy and profitable and stay in business. So we do everything we can to do that. We loan money. We have a revolving loan fund. We provide marketing. We provide website development, permitting issues, grant applications. You name it, that's what we're responsible for. To a degree, what we are is one-stop shopping. Any business in this area who needs any kind of assistance whatsoever should check with me first, because if I can't do it, it's my responsibility to know who can do it. So to a degree, as I said, we're kind of we're a portal for one-stop shopping for businesses seeking assistance, financing, what have you. We've been doing these workshops now for about 8 years, I think. We usually do 8 of them a year. They are on limited topics, like the one today. They have developed quite a reputation in that time. And we typically, I'm surprised we don't have more people here today. I would expect that we would have had 20 to 25 people here today. But I was talking about this with Teresa earlier, and I kind of think to a degree, some businesses are thinking, you know what, their unemployment rate is so low right now that if somebody walks through the door and they could fog a mirror, you know, I'm probably going to hire them. You know, maybe I'm wrong, but it kind of feels to me sometimes that that's what's happening with the economy the way it is today. Just a couple of other things. Charlie Eninger, who checked you in at the door, is the area business advisor for the Vermont Small Business Development Center. Charlie works out of my office. He spends most of his time working in Washington County, but he is up here on an as-needed basis. Charlie, if you don't know what the SBDC is, they do all sorts of things too, including assistance with business plan writing, financial projections, again, marketing, HR issues. Charlie can help you. I kind of work on a macro level. Charlie works more on a micro level with businesses, and he is available. His services are available free of charge, which is not a bad thing. Free is good. One of the most powerful words in the English language, as a matter of fact. So, restrooms are over there in the corner. There is a water. There are water fountains. There's also a vending machine for bottled water, if you prefer. And there are donuts and coffee over there. Please feel free to help yourself. And without further ado, this is Teresa Miele, who is going to be the facilitator of this event today, and I'll let her tell you something about her own background.
Sounds great. Thank you, John. Thanks for being here, everyone. If you haven't had a chance to drop your business card or record your information for the drawing that will happen later on this morning, please feel free to do so. I'm very flexible as a presenter. I prefer not to be up here lecturing at you. I prefer for it to be more interactive, and certainly I brought some information to share with you today as well. Feel free to get up, use the restrooms at your leisure, get more coffee, get water. I am not at all distracted by that, so no worries at all with regard to that. So, perfect. Thank you. So we're going to be talking about hiring today, and hiring right the first time. So what I plan to cover, and then I'll introduce myself, but what I plan to cover today is just everyone getting a chance to introduce themselves quickly, an emergency evacuation. I also am curious about what you want to be sure we cover today, because I'm hopeful that I have already included that rather in the material I provided. However, if I did not, I'd like to incorporate it. If it is something kind of outside the scope of our topic today, I will do my best to reach out to you with some resources and other information after the presentation. Beginning with the end in mind, recruiting the best people, obviously that's what we should be interested in. Interviewing, how do you figure out to pick that right person, that right fit, and additional resources, and last but not least, thank you. So if you don't mind, you've heard my name. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a minute, but could we go around and can we start with you, Scott? Introduce yourself and the company you are coming from, along with the number of employees.
Scott Hamilton, a company called LPA Design. We have about 14 employees currently.
Thank you, Scott.
My name is Sarah Mason, and I work for the Central Vermont Council on Aging, and we have about 32 employees.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'm Monique Beaudry. I work for Jasper Hill in Greensboro, and we have about 80 employees.
I'm Jim Blair. I run Eden Dog Sledding. I have about 4 employees.
Thank you, Jim.
Hi, my name is Julia Shire. I work for Salvation Farms, which is a nonprofit. We have about 5 employees.
I'm Devin Corrigan, Corrigan and Klein Artisan Builders, and we have 1 employee.
All right, thank you and welcome. I always think it's important to do an emergency evacuation before we start any kind of workshop or meeting. And here's a little bit about me. I was the HR manager for Rutland Plywood, and in 2014 we burned to the ground. Also, as being part of the safety person for the plant, I have found that in real experience, which I hope no one ever experiences, it's really important if you are not making sure that your folks are trained with being aware of their surroundings and how to evacuate in an emergency. I can't reinforce it enough. It is what saved our employees, and it is what allowed them to evacuate the building at 1 o'clock in the morning in darkness safely and without incident. We lost everything, but that's all replaceable. Our employees are not. So with regard to emergency evacuation, should we need to evacuate the building today, you will go out the exit behind you or to the left, evacuate out the door in the hallway there, and we'll meet up near the baseball dugouts. So enough about that. So a little bit about HR Acquired and my little puppy Willie, who's not so little anymore. After Rutland Plywood burned in 2014 and we closed out the insurance claim, I had to figure out what I was going to do. So I went into business for myself in 2016. I've been very fortunate to help my business kind of evolve and grow. I have clients anywhere from 1 employee to over 50, and I do what I tell people is people and papers. So I do all things admin, and I customize that for companies, and I also provide any kind of employee support. And it's on the continuum of what we all do in HR, pre-hire all the way to separation of employment. So I work with people throughout all over the state as they need me, and it's been very interesting. I've been able to work with companies beyond manufacturing, which has been just fascinating. I've met a lot of really, really great people and learned a lot about how to really provide good support. And Willie came to live with us probably in July at 10 months old. I've never had a puppy before, but I have learned a lot, and he has just become the mascot for HR Acquired. So we're on Instagram, so if you like dogs and you want to see Willie talk about some HR kind of issues, please feel free to follow us on Instagram, and then I usually do a follow-up with my Facebook account that provides a little more detail. So just to give you a sampling of what we've been through, Willie broke his toe. So we had a workers' comp issue at HR Acquired, and he had restricted duties, and then he transitioned back to work. So we have funny little pictures of him with his poor broken toe and a splint, and then related articles on Facebook page. So it's been kind of fun. Never expected that to happen, but it kind of adds an element of surprise and fun to what I do every single day. So what do you hope will be covered today? If we could just quickly jump into that.
So some new, unique ways of recruiting or looking for employees
New
in rural areas.
Yes, we will be able to touch on that for sure. Anything else?
I think one of the biggest challenges that I have is that you have candidates that look great on paper, they interview well, have great references, because who's going to put a reference down that's, speak horribly about their workflow and how they do things. How to just shape the way you ask questions that is in an appropriate way, but to really get at what fundamentals you're looking for, so that you can kind of, shake up that very put together picture that everyone comes in with
And prepares
to
for.
keep the right person. I mean, you invest so much time in someone that if you don't find the right person and train them well and keep them, you've just lost a lot in that process.
You've described everything well, and we definitely will be covering that.
Great.
What else? Yes?
I think to kind of follow up on that, especially when we're hiring younger people or who don't have as much experience, and we're wanting to kind of shape them, how to really read between the lines or ask the right questions to determine maybe if they don't have the exact skill sets or experience we're looking for, do they have the qualities that we want to learn, to be shapeable, to learn kind of in the process that we want them to, and have the capabilities, and how to see the best in, how to discern and be really efficient in that discernment of whether people are kind of worth that risk of, the few interviews to see if they're capable or not, or when to kind of just say, no, it's not enough.
Anything else? Yes.
Well, I'm curious what, from your perspective and maybe other people's perspective as well, is of what an employee wants from the company, because I've seen, in my generation, that's changed a lot from what is typically understood in an employee-employer relationship. For example, number of hours to work alone. There's a lot of talk about quality of life versus working too hard, et cetera, that kind of thing. And, I'm in the building industry, when the sun is shining, you have to be working. So what are the requirements there for that relationship, and how do you navigate that?
All the questions, observations, anything else?
One more question that I have is how to ask questions, or if there's testing or things that you can do to really well assess someone's computer and tech savvy. We have people who, as the Council on Aging, we welcome people of all ages, and just because you're a certain age, it doesn't mean that you are better or worse at technology. We have people who are younger who don't do well with certain things, and we have older people who are leading with other sorts of efforts, and how, a lot of people come into an interview and they're like, oh yeah, I know how to do things, and then we find that their skill set really, so how to use that recruitment and interview process in a way to really be able to assess those concrete skills.
Anything else that comes to mind? I'm pretty sure I have all of this covered. If you find that we need to dive into a little bit more detail, feel free to make sure that you bring it up, but I'm pretty sure we have it covered. So to begin, what you want to do is to think about the end. And we do this in lots of ways in our businesses. I find that we don't do it as well, if at all, with employees. People are familiar with Stephen Covey. I will not read every slide, but I will read this one. To begin with the end in mind means to start with a clear understanding of your destination. So when you're thinking about that employee, that position, you want to be thinking about what you want. And you have touched on that in all of your observations of what you're hoping will be included today. But you want to be really clear about what is it that you want. It also means to know where you're going so that you better understand where you are now, and so that the steps you take are always in the right direction. So very often we're thinking about the people coming in the door or the people that we currently have. I encourage people to go back to what is it that your business needs. It's not about that person. It's not about that individual. And the one thing that I find I'm most often supporting, especially around performance issues or employees who are struggling, is that folks are going to the person and thinking about the person. What they're not thinking about is what I need for my business. What does my job description say? How does that fit into our overall mission, whether that's productivity, quality, or safety? Those three things you should always be mindful of. Then once you can answer those questions, you can then figure out what you need to do to support that employee, whether we're counseling them in to stay, which is what we would hope based on what you just said. We don't want a revolving door. We want people who are going to stick. So always be focused on what you want for your business and what your business needs, and then work to see whether that person is a fit or not and what you need to do to support them. So that's when they're within your business, but you also need to be thinking about that with regard to recruitment. So here we are, hiring, join our team, take the next step, come in, we're hiring, are you awesome? So as you're thinking about attracting people, think about what message you are sending out there. Very often what I find is we pretty much do fire, aim, ready. We need a person, we need them yesterday. We already talked about the mirror test, and I was pleased that I brought my mirrors today because I talk about fogging the mirror. We'll hire, and very often as HR people or the people who are in charge of the recruitment and hiring, we are pressured by the supervisors or by the folks in whatever department. We have to have somebody, we have to have them now, you don't understand. And so we knuckle under, don't we? And we settle. And then what do? We spend a lot of time, which I think is not fair to the individual we bring in who isn't the right fit, because you're spending your time one way or another, either helping this person get on board with the job or very often turning them over. So think about that when you're being pressured to make decisions. You are going to spend your time either way. You're either going to spend it producing whatever product or service you provide and be short-staffed, or you're going to be spending it with that employee who's now costing you money and you're still having to produce, and really, you're still short-staffed, aren't you? Because they're not going to last, and you've spent a lot of money on that. So you've all touched on that already. We often will post and pray. I think that's also what you're touching base on. We need somebody. We're going to put an ad up. We're hiring. We're open. Come join our team. We really need to work very differently than just sticking an advertisement out there and thinking that that is going to solve our problems. If that solved our problems, we wouldn't be asking all these questions. So I'm not saying you shouldn't advertise. I'm just saying that there are a lot of different ways to go about this, and a lot of it has to do with relationship. So you, as I said, you hire your new employee, or you're going to hire a new employee. You really need to be thinking about applying the same product and service marketing principles and practices to recruitment. How many people have thought about that? How much time do you spend and how much money have you spent on marketing your business? Lots, right? Because if you don't sell your product or service, you're not in business very long. What if you took the time, energy, talent, the knowledge that you have with regard to marketing your product or service and applied those principles to hiring an employee? Or better yet, not hiring an employee, hiring a member of the team. Now, we can't just change the name employee or the title employee to team member, because that's not authentic. But if truly you are inviting people to come and work in your company and not just produce a product or service, but you want them engaged, you want them to love coming to work every single day, and you're going to listen to their ideas, you're not promising you're going to implement all of them, but if you want them to be their problem solving along with you, coming up with better ways of doing what you've always done, and maybe we're blind to because we're doing it in the same way all of the same time, and because we're so close to it, we don't have fresh eyes. New employees are awesome opportunities to see if there are any process improvements. But we very often say, we can't do that here. We don't do it that way. Now, there may be, for example, in manufacturing, some very good reasons why we can't change up our process. Because maybe somewhere down the line, either before or after, it affects the quality of the product that we're producing. It is possible that if you're in human services, that you may not be able to do that for some regulatory reason. I wouldn't just shut the person down, though, because that's an opportunity to teach that person more about your industry. And why or why not, you're not able to do that in that particular way. So instead of shutting the conversation down, you're actually engaging them. So I know when we talk about recruitment, it often kind of slides over into those current employees, but it really makes the point that if you are trying to find the right people to come to work for you, you've got to market yourself. You've got to sell it. It isn't about just posting it and going, boy, I really hope somebody good shows up today, or I hope I've got some good applications in the mail, or I really hope that resume looks the way that it needs to, or that they have a great cover letter. And you're right, who's going to write a bad reference? I really don't even look at references. I call references. If someone provides references for me, and a lot of companies will ask for references, written references, I really don't look at those very much. I'm curious about them, but nobody is going to put anything bad in writing. I'd rather have a conversation with the person. I can get a better feel. And that's one step in a long process. So what questions should you ask yourself before you hire anybody? What do you think? Putting you on the spot. What are you looking for? Job description. Okay. What else? Okay. Sure. So what resources do you have? What technology do you have available? What else should you be thinking about before you hire anybody? Let's move forward. So I'm not going to play some of these video clips simply because I'm not sure it's going to translate well, and I'd rather have the conversation engaging with you. So what about this? Can we do this job differently? Do you really need to fill that position? How many of us ask that question before we jump in and go, oh, we have an opening? And I will send you these video clips. They're quick. And Mel Kleeman, who is one of the people that I really, really like to listen to because he's really good at this stuff and really very innovative, and all of his books, one of which I'll be raffling off, are available to us. And he goes through this very succinctly, I think. But can we do the job differently? How many people have heard of job carving? So job carving is essentially taking a look at the job and looking at the essential functions of the job, and then looking at those non-essential functions, because maybe, for example, if you have a front desk person who's responsible for customer service, answering the phone, and it's all customer focused, but if you have this person filing, handling the mail and mail distribution, photocopying, putting binders together and that sort of thing, guess what that automatically does? It automatically limits that person to see as many customers as possible. And if you're trying to get as many customers through the door and they're having to wait and things are kind of piling up, you've created a problem for yourself. So do a job analysis. Take a look at that job and see if there are some job duties that could be carved out of that. Free this person's time up so that they're seeing as many people as possible. And over here, maybe it's 10 hours a week that you need someone. Did you know there are people out there that would just want to work maybe 10 hours a week? And those job activities are probably more like minimum wage or a little above. And you may be paying that front desk person $14 or $15 an hour for less than $14 or $15 an hour tasks. So there could be a cost savings there. So look at and analyze some of your jobs because you may be able to do them differently. Can we do this job without hiring someone else? We've covered. Do we need to do this job at all? How many times do we think about the fact that we may not need to do this job at all? Hard to imagine because we're usually in our stuck place. Here's an important one. Would you work for you? Would you work for some of the supervisors, department leaders, head people? Would you? Because if you wouldn't work for you, little hard to market why someone else should. We forget that an important part of that employee piece, I think that you're also touching on, it's about relationship. Now, people don't just get to come to work and do whatever they want, right? We have a job, we need the job done, but at the same time, if you're looking to attract and retain people, we best be looking at how we interact and how we take care of the people who come to work for us. Because you're right, that work-life balance piece is so important, and more important perhaps today, and I think that's a good thing. People aren't willing to just come and get beat up at work. I don't like to go to work and get beat up at work. No one likes that. So if our interactions are less than positive, and that doesn't mean we don't hold people accountable, but there is a way of holding people accountable in a respectful way. And if that's the kind of environment that you have, what I would ask you to think about again is your product, whether it's an actual, hard product or a service. What happens when your customer is unhappy? What do? They complain. Who do they complain to? Anybody who will listen. And what happens with social media these days? Anywhere. So it used to be if someone complained, they'd tell 10 people. Well, multiply that 10 now. So it's out there. Don't buy from this company because guess what happened to me? And how many people do they tell if they have a wonderful experience? Used to be kind of one, probably more now that there's social media because we can reach further. But think about that impact. So you're all over customer service, right? You're going to make sure that your clients are super happy because if they're not super happy, they're not going to come purchase from you, and then you will not be in business. Ever thought about what happens when your employees aren't happy and having a good experience? How many people do you think they tell? And who do they tell? Now, this isn't intended to be, a love fest at work where it's kumbaya and everyone has to be happy all of the time and it is our job to bring the happiness factor to work. What we're really talking about is what kind of work environment do you have? Because if you don't have a decent place to work where people understand that, hey, everything's not going to go smoothly, because that's the way life is. But when we have to get down to it and there's hard work, guess what? I can depend on my supervisor to be there and listen. I can expect that I'm going to be held accountable. I can expect that the people around me are also going to get held accountable, and I trust and feel respected. And that's what I like. If you have a choice, and we all have choices, because especially today, because unemployment's so low, and that's what we're bumping into. People have choices. And if they are going to pick who they work for, and you touched on this there, I think, as well, when you said, how, I think it was you, that said, about the employee kind of interviewing us as well. Actually, I think that was Devin. The employee is prepared to interview us and decide. I love it when an applicant comes and says, all right, I have some questions for you. That tells me they've looked into my company. They also want to make sure it's the right fit. So you want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to be an engaging employer, to be really clear about what your expectations are, because the more clear you are, the easier it is going to be for you to recruit. Because you don't want that to be a barrier to employment for folks or a barrier to your recruitment process, just like you wouldn't want that to be a barrier to your customers coming to your door to purchase your product or services. Same concept. It's taking what you know over here and applying it to employees. That simple and that complex at the same time. So, why shouldn't someone come to work for you? We talked about this a little bit in terms of the attitude check, but why else might you think people wouldn't want to work for your company? Made up company.
Well, for our organization, being a nonprofit, we can't compete with the for-profit world, and I think sometimes people have, especially in a rural state, that they're going to make salaries or have benefits or they're just things that aren't necessarily realistic or something that we can even offer. And we try to be really transparent, but people go to career counselors and different things and say, oh, well, they may have a bracket of where they're, we're trying to be transparent about what we can offer somebody, and they're being told to ask even higher, and we're like, we're being very clear with what we can offer, and so they're seeing that as like a beginning point when we're trying to show them the range. So it's an interesting kind of just dialogue that plays out.
Yes. And that very often is what we tell ourselves, right? They shouldn't come here because the pay isn't what we think it should be. We're not competitive, perhaps, in the overall marketplace. Maybe they don't like this kind of work. They won't like the schedule. Maybe it's too long of a commute, especially in a rural community. And what I would tell you is that we often shoot ourselves in the foot with that. I think it's really important, to your point, to make sure that we are realistic and know. But what I do find is that very often we sell ourselves short. Let me give you an example. I like for there to be a compensation package where we're actually training not only our employees, but also people who come to the table. Certainly there are going to be people for whom our rate of pay, benefits isn't going to be a fit. We know that, and we may not be able to be flexible with that. That's the reality of it. On the other hand, very often folks don't know the value of what is provided with regard to benefits and other things that we offer. They just look at the pay. Sometimes they may look at whether you provide health insurance or not. What we don't do a great job of, even with our own employees, is laying out everything that we provide. So when I do employee orientations, for example, especially I'm thinking of an employee orientation, and this was several years ago. It was for a production position, and as part of the orientation, I gave an example of what the company actually provided. It was a $12 an hour job, 40 hours a week, so I showed that, and annually what that amount was. 2 weeks vacation, annually what the company provided. All of the payroll taxes, because the company provides that as well. Yes, they have to, but the fact is the company is paying that for this position. Personal protective equipment that was provided. I think there were uniforms that were paid for and provided. Holidays that were paid for and provided. The employer's portion of the premium for health insurance, dental, the disability insurance, short-term and long-term, the premium that was paid for. You get the list? How many of us do that? This $12 an hour job that kind of looked like, turned into this over $24,000 in benefits. So do the math for people. And for your employees, you should show them every year what your company is doing for them. Because very often we'll say there was an increase of X percent in health insurance and the company is absorbing that. Insurance went up 1 or 2 or 5 or 25% this year. The company's not passing that cost on to you. What do employees do? Eyes glaze over. Means nothing. It means a lot when you tell them what that actually translates to and show them. Here's the total amount of the premium. Here's what the company's paying. Here's what you pay. Show them. Educate them. Because guess what? Now you have ambassadors within the company sharing how generous you are. Or the realistic part of it is, you know what? We may not be as competitive, but I have a job that I go to every single day. I love what I do because you should come work with us, and here's why. So that you have people within your company selling your company. So the more educated and savvy they are about what you provide, the more educated and savvy they're going to be when they're talking to other people about why they should come work with them and why you should be on a team with me. Make sense? Yes.
I'm also work for a nonprofit, and I personally, struggle with this mentality of like Vermont doesn't pay very much, and like that's just the way the nonprofit world is, and also looking at the other non-monetary benefits of my work,
Yes.
like a really flexible schedule and blah blah blah. Can you speak to kind of both of those, of the mentality of Vermont doesn't pay a lot and folks should kind of just be okay not getting paid
You'll
a
have to
lot?
drag me off my soapbox if we go there.
Yeah, and
Sure.
and the degree to which companies should be kind of to the point that you're making of a work-life balance, or the other benefits of being a great personality of a company, and kind of the degree to which that should or should not offset a low salary is something that I struggle with, of how to think about that.
Let me think about that for a moment. So you're absolutely right, and I would definitely, so when we're looking at schedule, commute, benefits they're not just your health and disability and so forth. There are going to be other types of benefits within your company or organization that you provide, and one of them may be a flexible work schedule. So I worked probably 10 years in human services myself for Rutland Mental Health Services, and ran our employment service. And one of the benefits, honestly, was a flexible schedule. It was also, if you're a person who really likes to make a difference, if you're a person who would like advancement within the company, or if you're a person that is just, I want to find a place, I don't want to supervise anybody, I don't want to advance. So look at all of the different reasons why someone might come to you, and look back to your team, look back to your employees. We should know, and that's actually you are transitioning us into some of the other slides, but if you don't know why people work for you, you need to find out. You need to let them tell you why they're there, because they're going to tell you things you never even thought of. So one of the non-traditional hiring pools that I've looked at were people who were retired, people who were looking for their second career. I literally called up GE and said, you may have some people that are looking for something very different to do. Two of the best people I ever hired, 2 men who were retired from GE, lifelong manufacturing fellows, who came and worked for us and supported people on both of our community as well as our employment teams. 2 of the best hires I ever had. One of them wanted to work full-time, 40 hours a week. The other one just wanted 20. The most flexible people ever, and they brought such joy to our team, such great ideas. They brought a lot of business concepts with them. So you are absolutely spot on, because it isn't just about the pay and benefits. It's about working with great coworkers. So if you're holding your coworkers accountable, other people are going to want to come and work with them. If you have people that aren't doing the job because you have folks who are afraid, if I don't hold people accountable in a respectful way, guess what? Who likes to work with other people when you're having to do their work because they show up late and leave early and take advantage and goof off? Nobody. So again, there's a lot of correlation between recruiting and retaining people with what you already have. So it doesn't mean you're not going to attract and retain people. It's just you're going to want to pay attention to this over here so that you are supporting and counseling people to do the work that they need to do as your employee. It's also about growth and opportunity. What else can I do for your company? Are there things that I may be able to advance to if that's what I want? If there aren't, then you're not going to promise them. You're going to be really honest and upfront. This is what we have available. We're a small company. We have 4 employees, and this is the job. But maybe there are other things, and Scott and I were talking about this earlier, that very often I find that there are people who are looking for a job that don't want to work for a great big company. Want to know why? Because they want to make a difference. They want to be engaged in a different way. They want more of that personal relationship and connection, even with coworkers. They want to be able to see a really great product made. And they want to be that person that aspires to, 100% quality product every single time, safe and on time. So it isn't just about pay and benefits. Interesting work. Attracted a lot of people. Rutland Plywood. A lot of people wouldn't think it was interesting work. I thought it was fabulous. It was dirty. It was hot. I could not have done what those men and women did, but guess what was really cool? It wasn't that we made a pretty product, and I used to say that. We don't make it pretty, but we make a high-quality product. Let me show you what 99% of our customers who have business insurance, interruption insurance on us have made out of our product. How would you like to see that happen? And guess what? Our products are sold around the world, and your hands will have touched it. I'm not making it up. That's all truthful. But folks who had been there were, they were into the, it's hot, it's dirty, it's hard. That is all true. But how cool is it that 99% of our customers had business interruption insurance on us? I get jazzed about that. And guess what? When we burned, there were companies that came back to Rutland Plywood begging them to go back into business because they couldn't find the quality, and they did. They're a small little company called Stratavant now. But recognition. Thank you, please. I appreciate that you're here today. How are things going? So those are things that we can be doing at work. Love of the product or service, like I said, flexible scheduling you touched on, total compensation package. So why do your best people come to work for you? And I will send these slides to you, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes unless you like to. Do you know why they stay? So some of this is, wow, I never thought of asking my employees those questions before. Do you give them the tools they need to do their job? Do we ask? If you haven't looked at stay interviews, Google that. A stay interview is a very brief conversation, but very intentional and very structured, where I sit down with Scott and I say, Scott, I just want to talk with you for a few minutes and see how we're doing. Is there anything that you need? Did I tell Scott he was going to get it? Because he could say, I need this great big new fancy shiny piece of equipment that's going to cost $100,000. Maybe, maybe not. But Scott may say, you know what? If I had this particular thing, it could help me do my job better. Or if we actually changed up our process, even if it's with a timesheet, it doesn't matter what the example is. You have so much wisdom from the people that currently work for you, but we forget to ask. So where can you find great employees? So things to think about to get us started. When do you start recruitment? And where do you recruit? So you already heard post and pray is not going to be the right answer. When do you start recruiting? And there's no wrong answer. I promise I won't pick on you. There you go. Okay, so we want to make sure that we know what the job description is. So that we have a clear understanding of what we're going to be recruiting for. Any other thoughts, ideas? Recruiting is marketing. You've already heard me say that. If you're a recruiter nowadays and you don't see yourself as a marketeer, you're in the wrong profession. If you're not marketing, you're not in it to win it. Don't post and pray, hunt. So when do you start recruiting? You should be recruiting all of the time, not just when you need somebody, because that's when we make decisions under pressure. If you're not recruiting this moment, even though you don't have a position open, missed opportunity. Hand out your business cards. Have conversations. I have some of the best stories from people who have recruited unbelievable people. One of my favorite stories is about an executive director who was new to town, and she stopped to get her coffee every single morning at this particular deli, struck up a conversation with, happened to be a woman behind the counter, and said, after the course of a couple of weeks, "What are you doing here?" And the woman said, "Well, I just needed a job, and I found this job, and I kind of like it. Ever thought of doing anything different?" "Well, I don't know. What did you have in mind?" "Well, I happen to have an office manager position open right now. Can't guarantee anything, but I'd love it if you'd apply. Here's my card." Now fast forward. She's the new office manager. I come in to meet with the executive director. I walk into the office. The woman is up from behind her desk, reaches her hand out and says, "Good morning." And I started to say, "Good morning, I'm Teresa." She said, "I know exactly who you are. Joan will be ready to meet with you in a moment. Let me call and let her know that you are here, and then let me get you some coffee." Which I love coffee, so that was like the awesome thing to say to me. And then proceeded to do so. She was working at a deli. Now, there's nothing wrong with her working at the deli. She's one of the best office managers, and her performance was stellar. Another story about a woman who happened to buy her shoes in this particular place, and the customer service rep for shoes was amazing. Treated her really well, helped her pick out the best shoes. She was really happy with the service that she was provided. Well, the shoe store is going out of business. Guess what this woman was doing? Having a conversation with the customer service rep to say, "Well, you know, do you have plans? Do you know what you're going to do next?" "Well, no, I'm not really sure." "Well, if you're interested in finding out more about selling insurance, here's my card. I'd love to tell you more. If you get me your resume, I'll pass it along." Top-notch hire. Go where the people are that you think could be a good fit. Because when you're doing that, that's where you're really striking upon that good fit piece. So we're out and about all of the time. You know, what if you had a little business card that was just for recruiting? And it had a phone on it, and it said, "Call me." Something fun like that. What if you're in construction? These just came to me, so I'm quite thrilled that I came up with this. They're a little hokey, but it's fun. What if you had a picture of a hammer and a nail, and it said, "Nail it with us," and your information on the back? So think about your industry. It doesn't have to be fun and gimmicky. It can be, just because it catches your attention and it's different. You can simply use your business card. But if you're sitting in a restaurant and you're getting excellent customer service, or wherever else you may ordinarily go, stop and think right now of places you go where those employees just knock your socks off. That is true. That's called poaching. And understandable. On the other hand, if I had an employee, and maybe this sounds a little too altruistic, but if I had an employee that was in an entry-level position that I could not grow, and they had an opportunity elsewhere, wouldn't you celebrate that?
Yeah, so maybe it's more like connecting with other businesses and like have them leave or go to another company and stay with someone that you know.
There's also looking at other companies with regard to if you have some part-time positions and they have some part-time positions, or you have seasonal and they have seasonal. Have you ever thought about getting together and going, you know what? Do you have any great employees that aren't, finish up employment here? And maybe we could interview them to come to work over here. So if you don't have all full-time positions, you can get very creative with that. And there are some folks who really aren't looking for, the benefits. So again, we tend to look at things in a box instead of mixing it up. And some of that just can come from the conversations that you have with your employees. We had to get creative with the work that we did in human services because every client we served had different work schedules if they were working. They had a different number of hours. It was like a jigsaw puzzle that we had to put together, and there was no picture on the box. So we came up with the most unbelievable schedules, and then if a new client came on board and someone left, guess what? You had to shuffle that all up and make a new picture. So it can be done. Would I prefer not to do it? Of course. But at the same time, if you can create, a system that allows for that to happen, that is predictable, because you need it to be predictable, not as uncertain as human services sometimes can be. You certainly need to have a rhythm in order to do what you're doing. Otherwise, you're not going to get the productivity, quality, and safety accomplishments nailed down. But it's something that I would ask you to think about, because if you are only looking at it from this perspective, you are going to miss some opportunities that could be a real good catch for you. And maybe there are some other benefits that you could provide, that folks might be looking for, but you won't know until you ask. But you should be marketing your business all of the time. So, like we said, start with your employees. What if you set up a referral program? Why not have your employees kind of be ambassadors, but reward them immediately? Don't say, if you send us someone and they get an interview, you get a $25 gift card. If they stay for 3 months, if they stay for a year, you get this. Immediate reward, regardless of the rest of it. What about your customers? This was an interesting one for me. Was working with a client who had very unique products in the retail market, handmade, homemade products, and she was looking for people to come and work for her and really struggling with where to find them. And so we talked about, well, where do you go? What do you do? And she actually sold some of her products at the farmer's market. And I said, well, what about people there? They might want to do something other than just make their own product, especially if they're a small home-run business. She found some of her employees there. So think about your customers. And again, I understand that, if you're not in a retail market, that may be a little bit more difficult, but certainly in human services, we found some of our clients, or some of our employees rather, from some of the clients that were served and some family members. Look for employees who are already employed. Like we said, consider a temp agency. That can be a really good option. And non-traditional labor pools. So what do I mean by that? And I will give you a list. But veterans, how many people here have on their application veteran friendly? How many people are working with the Department of Labor? How many people are working with Creative Workforce Solutions? Because there's a business account manager in every county who represents a number of employment service providers. So again, I'll give you the link to all of this, but there are lots of non-traditional labor markets out there, like I mentioned earlier, people who are retired that maybe want a little something else to do or that next new career for them. Write a creative ad, and I'm not sure if you can see this well, but it says marketing manager. Don't mention the M. Burger King. Don't mention the M. McDonald's. So get creative. And there is a link here, and again, you'll get this link that goes to show you just very different ways. What you want to do is engage people. Who wouldn't look at that and go, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then kind of think, that's kind of cool. I think I might check Burger King out. Kind of fun. If they're this fun with their ad, they might be kind of fun to work with too. All right, non-traditional hiring pools. I mentioned this, so you will get this link. How many people work with probation and parole? I did. Some of the best people I ever met coming out of corrections, wanting a different, life for themselves and a different chance. Met some amazing people. I had never had, and what I will say is the privilege of working with folks who were coming out of corrections before, simply because the work that I did before prevented that, because I worked with vulnerable population, or I worked in industries where we had federal contracts and we weren't able to do so. Rutland Plywood, they were very well known for being the employer who would hire you and give you a chance no matter what. You want to really make sure that your time is invested well, which is why we had a very strong relationship with probation and parole. I had a very strong relationship with the parole officers, and we ended up screening people in. We weren't preventing people from applying because we wouldn't want to do that or appear to be discriminating in any way, but I would actually ask the probation officers who understood what our jobs were. Why? Because they came, they did a tour, they understood the job, which you would want Creative Workforce Solutions to understand your jobs as well, so that they're sending you people who are more likely to be a fit. So if someone came out of corrections and the probation officer talked with them about working at Rutland Plywood, that probation officer thought that they had the ability to do so, it would get the stamp of approval. The person would come, and more often than not, they would have an opportunity to come and work for us. Did it work out all the time? Nope, but we got better at it. We got better at it because we had better conversations. We knew the questions to ask. We knew where other folks had struggled, and we put things in place to support them. Now, we were a larger organization. We had a full-time HR person as well as another full-time assistant, so we could manage that. But certainly you could modify some of this so that it could be a fit. And again, like I said, there were some people who just turned their lives around, and when we burned to the ground, some people went back to jail because it was a condition of their release that they have housing, and when they lost their income, they lost their housing. So sad. It is what it is. They got a chance, and I know of a couple of different people off the top of my head who are still working today that I went to bat for and said, I know you've been here 10 times and worked here 10 times. They don't want you back but I'm going to stick my neck out for you. And here's what I'm expecting you will do in return. Amazing people, amazing people. And I also had on their workforce investment boards. So employers are overlooking non-traditional candidates, and it's costing you. So if you haven't thought about those non-traditional places to look for employees, really explore that, because if you hit on one or two, there you go, especially in a rural area. So getting into some of the nuts and bolts, and I do know it's about 10. What time were we going to take a break? Okay. So every step in the process is a test. So you want to make sure you have a good process in place. And again, you're either going to spend your time beforehand or you're going to spend your time with that person who's not a good fit. And that isn't a good feeling for that person who's discovering this isn't the job that I'd hoped it would be, nor is it going to be feeling very good for you because you're now having to have these difficult conversations. And congratulations if you are having the difficult conversations. What's worse than that? Avoiding them. That just gets bigger and bigger and messier and messier. So screening, look at those resumes and cover letters. Be critical when you're looking at them. It doesn't mean you're going to just toss them aside and dismiss them, but know what you're getting into. I mean, if someone is going to do a lot of writing for you and recording data and filling out reports, and they have grammar and typing and spelling errors, guess what? I'm probably not going to consider them seriously for this particular position. I may, but I sure am going to have a conversation around, what it takes to do this job and how do you see that as a fit, given that I'm seeing this, okay? So it's not that you have to dismiss them, but go into it with your eyes wide open. You need to have an application. I won't get on my soapbox, but I hear so often, yeah, we don't have an application, we get a resume. Resume can say whatever it wants. It also does not allow you to really properly evaluate candidates equally, and you also have nothing signed that says I'm telling the truth. You don't have the information that you're looking for. There are two things on applications you should not have. One of them is criminal background, unless you're in a particular category of employers that can ask that, and you shouldn't be asking salaries, and that includes benefit history. Those two laws went into effect within the past year or two, so you want to make sure that, number one, you're not asking about salary and benefit history as part of your interviewing process. You can ask about criminal background during the interviewing process. You just may not ask it on the application. You want to do a telephone screen, an interview. You want to do reference checks. That may include background checks in situations where there are vulnerable populations of people that are being served. You may do credit checks depending on the situation. You may do pre-employment drug tests. Not all employers do that. You may not do drug test, random drug testing in the state of Vermont unless you fall under Department of Transportation regulations. We do not allow random drug testing. We just allow post-offer pre-employment drug testing, drug and alcohol screening. Yes? Mm-hmm. So as part of your process, and we will get into a little bit more detail because I'm going to want to scoot through these slides so that we can actually have the experience of an interviewing process. I think telephone screening is pretty important because what I often find is that during that telephone screen process, I may ask, what are you expecting to be paid? What, do you have reliable transportation? I ask a bunch of other questions. I'll give you some examples, but your telephone screen should be built in advance to align with your interview process and your interview questions as well. I've had people, when I've asked them, thinking of this one person, and I asked if they had ever been fired or asked to leave a job. And she went on and on about her previous employer and how, she was giving specific examples and really trashing the employer. I'm like, wow, that is not, that's not where we want to go here. So sometimes during that telephone screen, people, will either find that that's just not a fit, and there's one example that wouldn't have been a fit in our place of employment. And again, it's not that I'm landing just on that one particular example, but there may be something that comes up that could be a showstopper, and it could just be that the applicant is looking for something different, but because you've asked those really thoughtful and insightful questions, they discover that, oh gosh, well, if that's the wage, this is what I really needed, so it stops there. A tour is another important thing to do as well before your interview. When you set up your interviewing process, we'd have everyone come for a tour because we were hiring, sometimes 6, 7, 8 people at a time. And we did the tour for 2 reasons. Number one, we wanted folks to know what we did because that was marketing for us. And we also wanted to make sure that they understood what the job was before they interviewed. There were some people that were really jazzed and they're like, wow, this Rutland Plywood, this is really great. I really want to be here. Yes, I'm going through the interview. We had other people that were like, oh boy, this is not what I thought it was going to be. This is not a fit. And what we would say to them is, now that you know what we do here, if you know somebody that you think would be a good fit for our company, please refer them to us. We'd love to see them. And they had a good experience with us.
I have a question about reference checking. I used to do a lot of interviewing for prospective employees. I used to do something that may not be legal anymore.
You're on camera, John.
Okay. If somebody, obviously they gave you a list of references to call, I would call them up, but I would also ask the person on the other end of the line if they could give me the name and contact details for somebody else who may be acquainted with this person who could also give me information. Because if that was not a person that the prospective employee gave you the name of, it was always a way to get additional information. But as I said, I'm not sure that any longer under today's regulations that something like that is legal.
That's a really good question. And I think the way that I would answer that is that it depends, because on your application, this person is allowing you, depending on how that's written, and I would encourage you to make sure an attorney reviews your application to make sure that that release is properly worded, that they are allowing you to do that reference check. And how that worded is going to depend on whether that is an option for you or not. If you're working in human services or providing some type of support to clients, they usually will have a release that they ask you to sign so they can do a reference check. What I would tell you about reference checks is, yes, you absolutely need to do them. You need to have the questions that you're going to ask. And some of it is verifying that the dates that the person said on their application and perhaps resume are the same dates that the employer has and that the job is the same. So you want to be comparing some of those concrete items. If you called me and asked me for a reference check, I would tell you the dates, location, and position held. Dates of employment, position held, and the location of the job. I will not tell you anything else unless I have a signed release from the employee. Now, if I'm doing reference checks, I'm going to be asking a whole list of things, and I am going to be doing my very best job to get you engaged.
Can you explain why you shouldn't disclose any more information as a past employer? Is it a liability for you? If you
Possibly. And again, there are some nuances. So you would want to get more information because it's going to depend on the industry. It's going to depend on whether you have a signed release. But typically, an employment handbook, unless you have some kind of other, agreement with your employees, you really only want to be sharing that information. And if they want anything beyond that, then you would want them to release you to be able to have that conversation. Now, we could do a whole probably other workshop on the ins and outs of performing some of these types of activities in terms of reference checking that we're talking about right now. Because if there has been something egregious that's happened, you may have an obligation to share that with the employer, the potential employer. So you really want to be looking at each situation individually and getting guidance. So 2 words that HR people often like to say, Monique, would you agree? It depends. So I would not encourage you to never share information, but if you are going to share information, you're going to want to know what that situation is about and whether you have the right releases and whether you are obligated so you don't get caught up in a negligent hiring situation. Good question. So again, every step is a test as you go through this process. Here are some of the things we've already talked about, so I won't repeat them, but sometimes people don't return your call. Well, I'm not chasing you. I may call you back one time, but if I call and your voicemail isn't set up, I am not chasing you. To me, that's a red flag. Now, if my employment base is so small that I feel I need to do that. Would I consider it? Probably, but I'm going to make sure that I have a conversation about that because that's a red flag. And I might say something like, I tried to call you, your voicemail was not set up. Here's what you need to know about working here. We expect that when we call, you're going to return our call. We actually would have expected that since you applied for this position, you made sure your voicemail was set up because that's how here's how it translates into our workplace. Here's how it's relevant. Shows initiative, it gets at some of those soft skills that you're talking about that are so important. If they don't show up on time, if they have different salary expectations, different scheduling expectations, it saves time. You're not having to sit with this person. And you're saving time for them too, right? Because they're finding out right up front, this is not a fit for me either. Thank you very much, I'm moving along. And they've had a good experience with you. And I record it because sometimes they'll call back and say, well, I never heard from you. And I'll be able to say, gosh, I tried to call you on such and such a date, your voicemail wasn't set up, called you on such and such a date, and I left you a message. And based on that conversation, because I am still curious, I may decide that I'll bring that person in for an interview. But I'm just going to be more aware of what I'm getting myself into and them into that could then translate into a problem in the workplace. But I'm probably not inclined to spend a lot of time with that person. Interviewing, what are your legal observations or obligations rather? So you want to make sure that you're paying attention, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this simply because I want to spend the time delving into more of the interviewing and the techniques and the ways that you might set your interviews up and asking questions. But if you don't know about the Fair Labor Standard Act, you need to. Because you need to know whether your positions are exempt or non-exempt, which we typically call salary or hourly, and whether you're obligated to pay overtime or not. And we do not get to just pick that. Sometimes this is a surprise. We don't just get to go, you know what, I would like this to be a salaried position. You actually have to vet that, and there are criteria that you need to be able to check off and go, I know this is a salaried position and not eligible for overtime pay because I looked at the Fair Labor Standard Act and I'm checking these boxes off. And it meets the salary requirements as well. The amount of time worked, record keeping, all of that is under FLSA. You want to make sure you have labor law posters. There are fines for not having your employment labor law posters up. And whether they can be an employee versus an independent contractor. This is all on the federal level. Now we get to go over to the Vermont level because there are some things federally that are required and then each state has requirements as well. So this isn't intended to make you feel like, oh my gosh, I don't think I want to have any employees. This is way too much. It's a lot here if you haven't heard this before. Chances are you are doing many of these things already without realizing it. And if you are working with the SBDC, they're here to help us. So if you are not currently taking advantage of that wonderful opportunity that we have, please do. They do a great job. And John also, with the RDCs, they also do a great job. But he's right, the SBDC really helps us drill down to this level. So leaves of absence, you may be responsible for paying, or these are unpaid leaves of absence, paid and unpaid, but remember Vermont earned sick leave law went into effect. So you may be responsible for paying some sick time, vacation time, paid time off, and you'll want to look at that law or have some assistance looking at that law to see what your obligations may or may not be. Again, making sure that the Vermont labor law posters are up, and there is that level of employee versus independent contractor test on both the federal and the state level, so you'd want to look at them both. So, we don't know what we don't know, profound statement here, but it is our responsibility to find out. We don't get a pass just because we're an employer and we go, well, gee, I didn't I didn't know about the Vermont Earned Sick Leave law. I haven't been paying my employees. Well, there's probably a penalty that will be finding its way to your door if you're not aware. So it's harder for us as small employers, I think, to keep track of all of these things. Like I just mentioned, it was in July of 2017 that the Ban the Box can ask about criminal records or criminal backgrounds on the application, and then prior to that was the Vermont Earned Sick Leave Act. And some of us think that the labor law posters, you put them up beginning of the year, you're done. Nope, because some laws change mid-year. So I always recommend that just go to some place like J.J. Keller and have their updated subscription, so that if the law changes mid-year, they'll send you the new posters, regardless of when a new law might be enacted. So now I can send a link for that as well. So be aware of the horns and halo effect. So what that means is when we're interviewing or getting ready to interview, if you knew that you were interviewing me and I was from Ludlow, Vermont, which is where I grew up, you are likely going to be more inclined to connect with me. If you also know somebody who grew up in Ludlow, you grew up there yourself, we went to the same high school, we know someone who knows someone, if we have some kind of connection that we discover as we are going through this process, you're likely going to be more inclined to like me. Just know that. I think you'd like me anyway and you'd want to hire me. But just be aware that our biases pop out, and we want to make sure people who are on our interviewing team are aware of that too. And conversely, our biases will pop out if something comes up in the course of our conversation that you happen not to connect to. And it happens, and it can kind of sneak up on us. And we want to be as fair as possible. So that's why you want to make sure you have a good process in place. So who's going to be on your interviewing team? What are the questions you're going to ask? Who's going to give the tour? And please do give a tour. What's the process? And we talked about this. Telephone screen, first interview. You may even have a second interview. And you may be sitting there going, this is too much, Teresa. I don't want to spend all of this time doing this. I need somebody yesterday. I would encourage you again to take a step back and think about the amount of time that you're putting in right now that isn't working as well for you as it could be. Because again, you're going to spend that time on the front end, proactively, or on the back end, chasing it. So, interview do's and don'ts. I think this might be a good time for a break. Perfect. So let's take a 10-minute break. I'll see you back in a minute. 10 minutes. And we're back. One thing I wanted to be sure to do, let me just pass around these books so you can take a look at them. I think the whole packet is like $50. Two of my favorites, 267 Hire Tough Proven Interview Questions, and they are good. And just this whole approach to Hire Tough, Manage Easy. Really good book, simple read. I go back to it all of the time, and I've been doing this forever. And then just the whole employee experience as well. So there are some really good tidbits in here that even if you took a few and implemented them, I think you'd find it really helpful. I structure all of my interviews based on this. Now, Scott, you had asked a question about higher level positions and kind of how to approach that. Some of this is going to be relevant. Some of it you're going to want to change up, because this is really designed more for your entry-level positions and maybe some intermediary positions, not CEO level kind of questions, which will be obvious in there. But some of the practices that you could put in place we're touching on. Mel Kleeman, as I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorites. He has a website, and again, you'll be getting this website as well. Lots of little video clips, lots of really good information. I subscribe to his newsletter, and some of what he brings up is just, it's so simple and it's just so brilliant if we just took the time to implement some of it. Interview do's and don'ts. There are none, right? We can do everything we want in an interview. But we can't ask about religious affiliation, pregnancy, political affiliation, race, color, ethnicity, age, disability, whether you're married, if you have children, if you plan to have children, if you're in debt, if you smoke, if you drink, if you have any previous workers' comp injuries. Now, sometimes in an interview, someone will share information with you that you don't want to know. Be prepared for that and be prepared for how you'll address it. It isn't uncommon in my experience to have someone who is older or maybe retired interview for a position, and I like asking the question, you know, why, two questions: why should we hire you, and why shouldn't we hire you? And what caught me off guard the first time is when the person said, well, I'm 65 years old and you might not want to hire me because I'm older. And my response to that was, thanks for sharing that. We hire for the person to be able to perform the job. We're really not interested in age, nor do we need to know. I know, but, well, we appreciate that, but that's not information that we take into consideration, which is truthful. Doesn't matter. Obviously, you've heard me share examples of people that we have hired who are beyond retirement age or in retirement. But you want to make sure that you are prepared for that, and you want to make sure whoever is on your interviewing team is prepared for what to say. If you're in the room, then you can be the person that handles it if that's appropriate, but you certainly want to give people a heads up. If we encounter something that someone shares that we were not expecting, we want to be respectful and appreciative, but let them know that's not something we consider. We're looking for the right fit to do the job, and then just move on from there. Do ask using behavioral interviewing techniques, and all of the questions in the book that's being passed around right now. It's behavioral interviewing. It provides you much better source of information. You can ask about skills, you can ask about experience, and you can ask work-related scenarios. And I usually will frame it at work. Tell me about at work, because sometimes, again, what I've run into, and Mel doesn't always put the at work, I do, because less is more. I am not here to interview you about your personal life. I'm not interested in your personal life. What I am interested in is whether you can do the job. So most often, a work-related experience is going to be relevant. Where you may find that folks have trouble with that, and so you'll just want to be mindful of this, is what you were mentioning earlier, Julia, is that if you have someone who perhaps doesn't have any work experience because they're fresh out of school. So you may want to reframe it then. So first interview, make sure you're asking behavioral questions. Don't ask closed-ended questions, which simply means questions that result in a yes or a no. You can ask them to bring a job evaluation. I love that. And frankly, they may bring one for you to look at. I had great job evaluations. I'd be happy to share that. If the person said that they didn't want to share it, would I say I'm not interested in them? Probably not. And some employers, honestly, don't do job evaluations. But you can ask that, ask them to bring it. That'll give you lots of really great information that's work-related. Don't reframe the questions. Don't restate the questions. Do not lead them. Hire for why, not for what. Why do you want them? So it is very tempting when someone is not understanding a question to reframe it. Now, is that hard and fast? No, because there have been times that the person has actually struggled a little bit, and I'll reframe it. There have been times when there's silence and you're tempted to restate. How many people know how long it takes some folks to formulate an answer or a response? About 10 seconds. Have you ever sat quietly for 10 seconds? That's a little hard for me to do because I'm one of those people that jump right in. And I have learned to sit back and allow the silence to sit. It isn't intended to make that other person uncomfortable. It is a respectful technique, though, or strategy, because they may need longer to think. Some of us think quickly on our feet. I don't always, and especially under stress in an interview. So give people adequate time to reflect and answer. And I've had people say, well, I don't really have an answer right now. I'll say, no problem. We'll just come back to that. And you want it to be really more like a conversation versus an interrogation. So you want it to be as comfortable as possible. So you're going to want to gather information. You're going to want to tell them about the job and the company. You're going to answer any question that they may have. And you're going to tell them what you want. You want them to be honest and truthful. So one of the things that is, again, a little bit awkward is setting the stage for your interview. So I like to have a nice, comfortable place for people to sit. You might have water or coffee available or tea. Maybe some flowers on the table, so that you're making it as a comfortable and welcoming an environment as possible. Because again, remember, you're marketing, right? So even though you're going to have this conversation, that doesn't mean that it has to be a stark room that you're sitting in. Make it pleasant. Have a little small talk before you begin. But when you start, you might want to start off by saying something like, we're going to take a couple of minutes to tell you about our company, and then we're going to ask you a bunch of questions. And when we're finished, we're going to give you a chance to ask any questions of us that you might have. Any idea about why that's an important thing to do first? Exactly. Because sometimes what will happen, and again, no hard and fast, just something I pay attention to. When I say I'm going to start off and tell you a little bit about the company, I'm not going to spill the entire beans about our company because I want to know if they've done a little research. Even if they haven't and I decide to hire them, I still want to know, how invested are you? What have you done to find out about us? And I'm also going to be looking for whether they listen to my instructions. We're going to ask you questions first, and when we get done, we'll give you a chance to ask us questions. Sometimes people will jump right in and start asking questions. That could be nerves, right? That happens. I'm not going to just dismiss the person, but I am going to try to redirect them, and I am going to pay attention to how well they listen to instructions. Because if you're hiring someone, what do you need them to be able to do? Follow directions. So again, these are, if you're thinking about the interviewing process, you may get a red flag in the telephone screen. You may have had some red flags on their resume and application. Now you've got a little red flag in the interview process. You're also gathering some really good information, one would hope, at the same time, some really solid information leading to a hire. But if you're bumping into these red flags, what you want to pay attention to at the end is the decision you make, such as one of the clients that I had that thought it was charming for one of their candidates in the way that, I can't remember exactly how they explained it, but there was something charming that the person did repetitively throughout the interview, and they thought it was awesome. And so they hired the person, not just for that, but for other reasons, driving this employer up the wall now. So it's not that it isn't something that they can't overcome. They sat down, had a conversation, so that the person got the support they needed to kind of change the way they're interacting in the workplace, but it became a barrier. And had they been able to have a conversation earlier on, it would have been a much better fit when they were hired. So pay attention to that, because if you're needing to redirect a lot in an interview, then you're probably going to need to redirect a lot in the workplace. What you might decide to do, instead of just dismissing the candidate, you might decide to have them come back for a second interview, because maybe they were just really nervous. Maybe they, just need to get acclimated a little bit more. So I'm not suggesting that you have to be hard and fast about every single situation, because you don't want to screen out really good candidates who might be just struggling with the interview process, because frankly, we don't do that a lot. Many people don't. When Rutland Plywood burned, there were some people that had been their first and only job. They weren't even sure how to fill out an application because they'd worked there for so long. They were really nervous and worried about going to an interview. They'd had one in their life, and that was it for Rutland Plywood. So we want to be balanced in our approach is really the most important message. And it's also important to say we're going to be honest and truthful with you, and we want you to be honest and truthful with us. If there's something that you need to bring to our attention that could be a barrier for you working with us, we'd like for you to bring it up. We'd like for you to bring it to our attention, because we'd like to be able to work with you if we can. But if you withhold information from us, and again, difficult conversation to have, and how you decide to have that, how you decide to frame it or not, totally up to you. But if you look at Mel Kleeman's material, he would ask you to bring it up right at the beginning, because we'd like to be able to work with you. So again, you're being welcoming, and you're also acknowledging that you will try to work through any challenge if you're able to do so, but you'd like to know about it up front. So, how long do you hang in there? How long should that interview be if it's not going well? As long as it takes to figure it out, right? I mean, on the one hand, we don't want to be rushing people out the door because they did spend the time, and we want to honor and respect them as a candidate, but we may find out that they're not the fit that we were hoping it would be. So we want to be respectful, but we also don't want to be disrespectful by going through the entire process if we know within a relatively reasonable period of time, and you're going to have to discern that for yourself. But don't feel as though you need to, if you've set aside an hour for an interview and you have 20 questions that you want to be sure that you gather information around, don't feel that you have to spend the entire hour. Make sure that you spend a respectful enough amount of time that you're not just shoving them out the door, but also don't waste their time and don't waste yours. So those are some conversations you're going to want to have with your interviewing team. And I do recommend an interviewing team, not just one person. Our most effective interviews have been when we've had two people interviewing, because we almost always see things that the other person doesn't, or we're able to validate what we have seen. And I encourage you to include your hiring managers and supervisors. And you may even include someone on the team. Now that could be a bit of a challenge, because if you're a real small employer, that may or may not work. On the other hand, I would encourage you to think about it, because the people who are actually doing the work, being engaged in that process, can be very insightful and very helpful. Any thoughts or questions about that? So as I said before, interviewing, it's a fact-finding mission. It's not an interrogation. So let's jump right in. What kinds of questions do you currently ask? What sorts of things do you ask of folks? Great question. Why did you decide to apply here? What interested you in this position? Excellent. What else might you ask? Great. Excellent. So what parts of the job do you think will be easy for you to do or hard or more difficult for you to do? What else might you ask? Great question. Yeah. Jim, I think you were going to mention something. Great. Other questions that you typically want?
Is that allowed? Because you're not allowed to ask like all kinds of other personal questions, but you can ask if they plan to stay or move.
I asked that question. Where you're going to get into trouble is where I got into trouble. Well, I'm going to retire in 5 years. Ugh. So just be mindful of that and just be prepared to say, I appreciate you sharing that. You know, we are looking for, you know, someone who is going to be able to fulfill this. Now, are you honestly going to have that tucked away in your mind? Yes. But you need to be, you know, you need to honor the fact that we are not hiring based on someone's age or decision to retire. And there are actually some really good articles out there. I had a colleague who is around retirement age. And because he looks as if he is on, you know, heading towards that part of his life, he actually has people asking him when he plans to retire. That is not a question I would encourage you to ask. And I believe it's because, not because people are trying to screen him out, but because they're not aware of how to, you know, ask the question. I do believe that overall employers are trying to be respectful. It's just that very often they're not trained in terms of what not to ask. And so I sent him some articles on how to respond to that situation from his perspective. Because employees practice, if they're good at what they're doing, they practice interviewing. They can read all of the questions that you're going to ask, right? So they're very well rehearsed quite often when they come in to do an interview. So I think what we're trying to get at and what that employee is trying to get at is how do you figure out what the right fit is? So you want to have some creative ways of asking questions that get you the information that you're looking for, not just the pat answers and certainly not the yes and the no's. You'll have done a really good job of coming up with questions that you typically use that are not kind of like out of the playbook of the traditional interviewing process. So I'm going to just run through some of the questions that I might ask. So in a telephone screen, I might ask things, you know, the standard things. If you're offered a position, when would you be available to start? Important to know, right? Do you have reliable transportation? I might need to know that depending on the type of job, especially if it's in a rural area. Depending on the job, I might need to know if they have a valid driver's license. If it's a CDL driver, I might need to know that they actually have a CDL. Salary expectation, I'm going to ask that because, again, I'm trying to screen them in, and I'm trying to be respectful not only of their time but of our time as well, because if this isn't a fit in some of these key areas, then we need to part ways and know that up front. I might ask if they're able to frequently lift or move, whatever our lifting restriction or lifting requirement is. And you notice that I said lift or move. Doesn't matter whether someone can lift it. What matters is can they move it? And we want to be careful that we are not causing a problem for that applicant or for us with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Because there may be people for whom lifting 50 pounds, in this example, is not a possibility. But there may be some type of device that allows them to move it from here to there. And guess what typically happens when we look at making things possible for people who might have a disability? Guess who else it helps? The rest of us, How about those doors that open automatically? Pushing that button helps me. Yes?
So it's legal to ask if it's a requirement of the job, if it's on the job description?
You would want it on the job description, and you'd certainly want to know that anyway. Again, your job description is the most important tool of communication in terms of what expectations you have of the job. How do we hold somebody accountable? How do we train somebody if we don't know what exactly we want them to do? How do we evaluate their performance if we don't know what they actually are supposed to do? And you're hearing me say that person, but what does our business need? It isn't about the people over here and what they do. It's what does our business need, and the document that we gather that information on is the job description. And I do have people sign off on the job description. I think that's really important because now you're acknowledging and I'm acknowledging that you understand all the parts of your job or what the expectations of the job are. And you may get differing opinions on that. That happens to be mine, just because I think it's really important to share that with an employee so that they understand this is important enough for you to sign off on. We want to be really clear. And that comes from my investment in your success. If continuing education is a requirement of the job, you might want to ask about that. You know, are you interested and available to participate in continuing educational opportunities when they're relevant to this position? So again, look at what you need for your company and what your expectation is. It doesn't have to be just about the job. It may be things that apply to the job. I do have on here, if hired, how long do you plan to stay in the job? And that's where I've bumped into people who are later on in their career experience saying, well, you know, I'm going to retire in 5 years. I'm like, well, no problem. I appreciate you sharing that. Describe a typical day. Again, now I'm getting more information about, okay, this is what I know our job is. I want to hear about your typical day, because when I hear about your typical day, then I'm going to be able to really think more about what things can transfer. What are your transferable skills into this environment? It doesn't mean that I'm looking for them to have done exactly what's happening over here. It's what have you done that applies to what we're doing. Sometimes it's hard for applicants to be able to see how what they do here applies over here, and where we bump into that most frequently is with veterans. So just be aware of that sometimes veterans, because of the world that they have lived and worked in, have a hard time describing what they did over here and applying it now that they are in a non-military environment and setting. What can you do for us that someone else cannot do? Through those questions, and there are a couple of other more specific ones on here about, you know, writing grants, because that was a key component of one of the positions. Through that experience, I'll be able to decide, or they will, whether they're going to move forward, or if they're saying thanks but no thanks, not a fit, or whether I am going to invite them to come in for an interview. So I'll decide then. And I haven't had any difficulty with that. And I will just say, if you were offered an interview, to move forward with an interview, when would you be available? And I always end with, do you have any questions for me? So how you structure your telephone screening is totally up to you. But there are going to be those key pieces that are going to be a showstopper, either for you or for them, that I think you want to have on here. You're going to want to look at your job description, because there may be some key pieces there, for example, grant writing. And it isn't necessarily that we were looking for someone in this instance who had grant writing experience, because a lot of people don't. But what we wanted to know is, do you have it? And then if they said no, well, now that you are aware that grant writing would be part of, you know, the functions of this job, what do you think you would do? How would you go about handling this part of your job? And had some great responses. Well, I would go online. I would take a course. I would look at the other grants that were had been written. I would look to other people within the department who had experience and could mentor me. So as people are answering the questions, you may have other questions that you should and could be asking them to help them kind of unfold the information that, gives you better insight. Any questions or comments about telephone screening? Anybody that feels like, I'm not sure I want to take the time? It's okay. Yes?
Approximately how long would you spend?
Good question. I find that most telephone screens that I've been doing are probably 20, 30 minutes tops. I mean, I don't want to spend an hour because I really feel like that's too much time. And I will call, and I'll ask if they're available then, and if they're not, then I schedule it and ask them what time is convenient. And you might want to think about whether you have them call you or you call them. I typically call them, but depending on what you're looking for, you may ask them to call you. Because again, whichever way you go, that is another part of the test. If they're available and answer the phone, if I get voicemail, and then there's always that caveat of, it happens to all of us, where something happens and you go to answer the phone and you get it on the last ring, and so again, it's not an automatic dismissal if I got someone's voicemail or if they didn't pick up on time. But I would expect them to call back, and if they didn't, would I call them? Yes. Why? Because weird things happen. There could be some kind of emergency that they had to take care of. And if that happened, I would want them to know I was thinking about them. And I'd want to reschedule. So I don't think any of us would want to create a situation where we're so inflexible that we're just dismissing people without considering that, life happens to us sometimes. And that's kind of that caring, relational piece of interviewing and recruiting that's really important. But what you're going to look for is pattern of behavior, right? So if it happens with the telephone screen, and then it happens with even the application getting submitted, and then it happens during the interview, now you're looking at pattern of behavior that's different than kind of a one and done situation that comes up. Any other thoughts or comments?
Something that we typically do, we find it helpful because we're using a lot of free online tools like Indeed.com or different places where you can post. We do a couple of written screening questions. So someone will email us their cover letter and resume, and then we'll send them some written questions. And so people who are just applying to everything typically don't respond back. So I feel like I don't have to do extra stuff with them because they didn't respond.
Right.
But if I were to start doing a telephone screening,
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of kind of where the placement of those screening questions. It sounds like from what you're saying, it probably would make sense to do that initial telephone screen, and then people that were interested in getting like a writing sample or further information, maybe using like one or two written questions.
I would say it depends. And the reason that I'd say that is that if part of your process is kind of screening for applicants who are actually interested, you could put some of those questions there. There isn't any reason you couldn't pull some of the relevant questions out of what I happen to have in the telephone screen and pop them up there. Because if salary expectations, if you're able to offer X and it's finite and there is no flexibility, then you may want to put that there so people don't apply. If you are trying to, because you're absolutely correct, you get so many applications from people who are really not interested at all, then I would pose a couple of questions as part of my applicant screening process. Then once I reviewed my applications and resumes, and again, I have a checklist for what I look for on the resumes, on the cover letter, and on the application. And it's my check sheet. And what that does for us is it helps us make sure we are looking at all candidates as equally as we possibly can. And it also helps us identify what types of patterns might be popping up. So again, it's information I'm gathering. It doesn't mean I'm completely dismissing, but if I have a stack of applications, resumes, and cover letters, and that's what I've asked for, and this group over here never bothered to write a cover letter, I'm putting them over here. They're not dismissed, but I sure am going to spend my time with this group of people who followed the instructions, who did a good job. There are no grammar, issues or spelling check, that it visually is appealing, all of the things that we're trained to do and set up. I'm going to spend time here. And then out of this group over here, I'm going to take it that next step forward with the telephone screen. I'm still going to keep these two groups, but I'm going to spend my time where I think I'm going to find the best fit of those candidates. So I would absolutely encourage you to do, what you've described. I think you also asked about, kind of testing. And Mel Kleeman is probably pretty big on testing. I have mixed feelings about it. I think it has its place, but having worked in human services as long as I did, what I've come to learn and appreciate is sometimes those tests screen really great candidates out. And I don't want to do that. I want to screen as many people in that are a good fit so that there's diversity in the workplace versus, ending up with all of these like folks. Because we know the more diverse our workplace is, the better creativity, the better productivity, the better quality, because that synergy just, it takes action. And people appreciate working with people who don't think the same way or respond in the same way. We may have bumps in the road as a result of it because people don't always think the same way, but that's where you're going to get your best teamwork, is by learning how to work with people who think differently and respond differently than you. So I would just be mindful of that. I would encourage you to think about things like work experience, though. So there are programs, or services I should say, through the Department of Labor and also through vocational rehabilitation, where someone can actually come and have a work experience or could job shadow. And you're not obligated as the employer, but you are giving people an opportunity to find out what the work is really like. You may, regardless of those services, you may decide that you'd like to invite someone to come and actually do a job tryout and pay them for taking a day and finding out what the job is really like. You may, as part of your process, want someone to demonstrate their computer skills. So you can build those things into the process. I think you just want to figure out how you're going to do it. And again, it goes back to, what does this person really need to know? What am I willing to train them for? So as soon as you kind of figure that out, the better able you're going to be to vet your candidates. Because some people are not going to come with those skills. You may want to just train them for it. Yes?
You just mentioned coming for like a trial period.
Mm-hmm.
Be that an hour, a day, a week. What are the legal requirements around that? Working in the trades, sometimes you don't know what the skill level of someone is, regardless of what they say. I think we all deal with that. You can ask them about computers, etc. Is it the employer or the prospective employer's responsibility to pay someone for their time, or is that part of an interviewing process?
I would pay them just because I think it's the right thing to do. I would also want to be looking at whether you could work with the Department of Labor, who already has a structure for that, or Voc Rehab, because folks may have some services available. I wouldn't ask them if they have those services, but as part of the employment service providers and Creative Workforce Solutions, they would be able to tell you and send you candidates that might have those services available to them. To be honest with you, it's great to be able to offer the job tryout for folks. What I find, though, is I have a job. I can't take time off from my job to come and spend a day or a week with you. But I have had clients who have wanted that. I have yet to find someone who wasn't already working that could take advantage of it. But if someone's going to spend time in your workplace, I would want to pay them. But there's also what you'd want to look at as well is the liability of it and what you would need to be paying attention to from your, your insurance carrier, which I imagine you would be covered, but you'd want to look at that. John, you were going to say something.
You have to be a little careful not to confuse a job shadow with an internship.
Yes.
Two very, very different things. An internship does require that they be paid. The federal government passed on a tracking down big time 2 years ago. That's
Correct.
a mistake. You cannot have somebody, if somebody comes in and is so much as filing a piece of paper in a file cabinet for you, you got to pay them.
So the Fair Labor Standard Act would walk you through that because John is absolutely correct that depending on what you're looking at, you would, if you were going to offer a job trial, for example, to see if it was actually a fit and you wanted the person to perform that work, I would want you to make sure that you put an actual process in place that was vetted through your insurance carrier to make sure you had everything lined up properly and your employment law attorney to make sure there wasn't anything that you were missing. And you heard me say employment law attorney. Not all attorneys, as you probably know, specialize in employment law, so it'd be important to find someone who did so that you weren't missing anything. And again, what we're looking at is a respectful process where you find out and they find out, is this the fit that you would hope it would be? That's it in a nutshell. Good questions. Good questions. So first interview, you heard me already kind of set this up. So we're going to share some information about XYZ company, and then we're going to ask you some questions. When we finish, we'll give you an opportunity to ask us any questions that you might have for us. So tell me about your first paying job. What was it, and what are the 3 most important things you learned in that job? That's my favorite question. I have a few favorite questions. Ever been asked that question before? Guess what sometimes happens? The candidate will flip right into, at my last job, I did such and such. And it could, again, I've had people who, they were nervous, and so they went to their go-to answer because that's what they were expecting. I've had other folks carry on in that venue and just take over the whole interview, and I've allowed that to happen a little bit just to see kind of how it would unfold and if I could redirect. I've had other people, like I said, they were nervous, and once we, allowed them to be able to kind of settle in a little bit, the rest of the interview went just fine, and we ended up hiring them and offering them a position. So we're working with people, so it's a little bit unpredictable. Interviewing process, and you're probably going to be disappointed to hear that you can put all of this in place, and guess what? You can still end up with someone who's not a fit. There is no perfect way of doing this. There are no guarantees. But we can certainly get better at paying attention and practicing what we're doing. I often find that, especially in some smaller companies, we don't have set questions, we don't have a set process, we don't prepare in advance, and that gets us into difficulty because that's where we can end up discriminating against folks without realizing it. That's where we're asking questions that we shouldn't be asking. That's where we're asking this group of people over here some questions, and then this group of people over here other questions. That's going to get us into difficulty. And we shouldn't just be putting an interview process in place just to make sure that we're not discriminating against anyone. That's really important. But what's more important is a respectful process that gives you, at the end of the day, some information that allows you to compare apples to apples and gets you to find the right people to invite into your workplace. So if we speak to your previous boss, or when we speak to your previous boss, what will he or she tell us about you? How would you rate yourself in your current job on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high? Strengths and weaknesses, just a different way of asking it. If you say 8, what makes you an 8? What would it take for you to go from an 8 to a 9? Very different feel to the interviewing process. Now, all of these questions come from that book, and there are dozens to choose from. Describe your computer technology skills and how you use them. So one of the things that you want to be asking people to do is to give you information, not just about the what, but how they use them, how they're relevant. Tell us about a time you had to troubleshoot a mechanical problem with equipment and vehicles. So you can change that up to whatever you need depending on the position. What additional areas did you need to consider? I always ask about safety. Tell me about a time you didn't follow a safety rule. What was it? What did you do? It's amazing the number of times that I've had some significant safety rules not being followed in manufacturing. Not that it's not important in all areas. That's a little concerning if you have folks deciding not to follow a safety rule. Well, I was really in a hurry. We really need to get this product done. Does it mean it's a no-go? Absolutely not. But it is something that I'm going to take under consideration, because if I have a choice between someone who, does well through the interviewing process equally as well, and one of them is very, safety conscious, and one's not, probably going to go with this person because they're going to be more qualified for the job. If I do decide to go with this one, I'm going to make sure that as part of our process, I bring that safety piece up and say, at XYZ company, what we want you to know is safety is number one. This is really important to us. So I really appreciate that you shared in your previous company that you didn't do X, Y, and Z. And this is them coming on board as an employee, or when you're offering the position. You could even say, we're going to offer you the position. Here's one thing that you would need to know in order to come and work for us if you're going to accept the position. We're welcoming you, but we want you to know about X. Does that make sense? Because I think sometimes we look at the interviewing process and we just leave it over here, and things come up and we don't talk about them. So there's no reason not to talk about them, in my opinion. What do you think is a good reason for missing work or being late for work? I did the safety rule. What is the last new thing you learned? How did you get up to speed and apply this knowledge? What do you think constitutes good management? So some of this can be entry level. You can also design, if this is really more for a supervisory position, then you can ask some of those behavioral questions around supervision and management. Tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker. How'd you handle it? Tell me about a time you had a conflict with your boss or a customer, and how did you handle it? So depending on the position, you can change your questions up to fit whatever scenario you're trying to gather more information about. What would you do if you observed a direct report or a coworker making inappropriate sexual, harassing, or racial remarks to an employee or a customer? Ever thought about asking what people would do in those situations? Sexual harassment and harassment on the job site is a really big deal these days. And also, when you're asking these questions, what are you letting that applicant know? Yeah, that we don't tolerate this behavior here. It's important enough to us to ask you about it. And it's not necessarily that you're looking for the perfect answer, because sometimes people won't know what to do. So for example, an answer I'd really be looking for, I'd be looking for the person to be able to say, I would step in and say, that's not acceptable behavior here. Now, a lot of people don't know how to do that. And they may say, I'll go and report it. I'll give the supervisor a heads up. And that's perfectly fine too. But now I have information about what I need to do in terms of when you see it happen. It's going to be really important for me to let that person know if they come to work here that that is awesome, that you're going to bring it up to the supervisor. Here's one other thing we want you to consider, because here's what we do here. We want you to feel comfortable taking care of it in the moment, because we're all here to take care of one another and be respectful of one another. And it isn't just chain of command. It also is what we do with one another. Describe a few situations in which your work has been criticized. How did you handle that criticism? So I'm going to stop for a moment and ask you if you have any questions. Do you want me to continue asking you questions to kind of give you the flavor of this? Yes? Mm-hmm. What, can you give me an example of a scenario you might offer?
Sure. So we run a workforce training program. So one scenario would be there are 2 trainees in a group of 8 that are having a lot of conflict and not getting along, and it's disrupting, work. What would you do to address it?
So, and is this for entry level or more of a supervisor manager?
More of a supervisor.
If they didn't, well, if they said it depends, then I would ask them to tell me more about what it was dependent upon. Tell me more about your thinking. Because sometimes folks will want to make sure that we're understanding that they're not just going to move forward and take this one path, that there are other things to take into consideration. So you may want to change your question up to say, 2 coworkers are having conflict. It's a team of 8, 2 coworkers are having a conflict, and describe a little bit more about what the conflict might be to give a little more insight. You could always make the argument that no, less insight can be helpful so you don't get bogged down in the details. And instead of asking them what they would do, maybe ask them, what would you think about? Or how would you, what steps would you take to address it? Now that's leading, right? Because now you're telling them you expect them to address it. But at the same time, this is a supervisory position, and if they don't expect to direct it or get involved and take the initiative, that's a bit of a problem and a big red flag to me. So I don't think it's a bad thing, because we're not trying to trick people. To your point, we're trying to gather information. So if you're coming up with it depends, that to me says I want to ask and get curious about their thinking around that. So tell me more about what it depends on. And that may help you. Again, you heard me say don't lead, don't reframe. That indicates to me it's your question if you're bumping into that frequently, not it's not that the candidate is necessarily struggling, because they're not sure what you're looking for. So typically in those situations, what I'll find is when you ask that question or tell me more or tell me you're thinking about, what would you be thinking about in terms of stepping in and intervening? What would you take into consideration? That is probably more of what you're looking for in terms of that process versus, the situation. Other thoughts or questions? It's hard enough on me here.
All right, I got one.
Okay, Scott, go for it.
Let's say I already know about a particular candidate, but he has no experience in a particular topic.
Mm-hmm.
How can one evaluate their chances of success in accomplishing that task? For example, raising money for a company.
Great.
Very experienced business person in many different ways, but that's one area that they've never delved into.
So in situations like that, actually before I jump in, any thoughts from the group here in terms of addressing this question?
I think we're just asking why they're interested, if it's like a career change or why are they interested, what do they hope? And I think drilling into if they're having any transferable skills of whether it be networking or developing relationships or whatever. That they can.
Anything else?
I think along those same lines, thinking of, some questions that speak more to those skills. And, how do you handle someone saying no? How do you feel about, calling people that you've never spoken to? Think of like what those job description pieces are. And then, because some of that stuff, I think you were talking about veterans, but I think a lot of times people that are either switching or they're trying something new or they have more of a versatile skill set, they don't always see how they can like fit into something, but they may, if you ask them about a particular skill, then that might develop the conversation a little bit further along.
Good.
Good observations. What I would add to that is that I would want to know what I was looking for the business. I would always go back to what does the business need? So if this is a person that doesn't have, and regardless of who the candidate is, known or unknown, can your business afford to hire someone who does not have that skill set and train them to it or get them trained to it? That's one question I would ask myself before I entertained that conversation. Because if you go to the individual first, if you look there first, you may end up selling your business short. So I would really do some rigorous thinking and talking with others, maybe even the SBDC, with regard to, can our company afford to hire someone in who is talented in all of these other areas, not necessarily about this person, without fundraising experience? What level or what range can we comfortably work within? Where can we be flexible? Where can we not be flexible? That will help you in determining what you need for someone stepping in. I would also encourage the conversation from both perspectives, and even asking the person or saying, we need someone who is not only solid in these areas, but our company needs someone who is solid in fundraising. You have not had that experience. How do you see yourself fulfilling this need? So that, again, if it's always going back to what the business needs, it's a much more comfortable conversation than saying to this person, yeah, well, you don't have fundraising. It's really great you have all this other stuff. You're taking the personal relationship piece out and allowing you both to be analytical. Because it's possible this person may have some relevant experience and transferable skills that you're not aware of, or he may or she may have an idea about fundraising that's different, but I would want to make sure that I had a conversation with someone who understood my business, that I could process this with before that conversation. Because I think you could easily, and this is just me kind of thinking out loud, I think you could easily get drawn to filling that need under pressure, especially if it's a tough position to fill. And I think you'll settle. And then that person will be unhappy and you'll be unhappy. And it could, cause a problem for your business to thrive. But if you're thoughtful about it first and you say, this is what we're looking at and this is what we need, and having that person, help, share how they see they can fill this need, along with other candidates. Or you may decide, you know what, this candidate is really strong in all of these areas. We really want him to come to work for us because we think our business can thrive here, but this fundraising piece, we can't, that's not something that we'll be able to depend on this person for. So we're going to have this piece carved out and accomplish the fundraising piece in this way. May not have to go part and parcel. John?
Yeah, Charlie and I had talked about similar thing earlier, actually had a speaker come. I teach a class at Johnson State College every year on how to start a small business. And my guest speaker last week happened to be a local retailer, and he said the same thing. And in today's world, very tight employment opportunity, tight employee opportunities, what they said, what this guy said, was, you know what? I hire for attitude, not train the skill.
Absolutely.
And that's something you really kind of have to do today.
Well, this is interesting, and I don't want to hijack the whole class, but it's almost like evaluating somebody who's entry level because they don't have those skills, the specific skills that are needed. But then again, I can't train them because I don't know how to do this either.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's why
If there are some exceptions based on if the job requires a very specific, if you're going to run a CAD machine, my guess is that you're going to have some type of skill. But
sure.
Think about the jobs in Vermont, and there are, I know, Devin, you're probably very specific with the skills that are going to be needed in construction. But what we're talking about is the fact that there are a lot of positions in a lot of companies where, and having owned 6 companies, I would say probably 80% of the time, I hired for attitude, saying I could teach the skill. Even if I had to pay for somebody to get a CDL to drive one of my trucks.
So you may not be the person that can train that person. And fundraising, I would have to say, you'd want to look at that carefully because that's a little bit different in some ways than the hard skills to operate a machine. Because you also have to have that comfort level with rejection and networking. And so I would think that you'd want to explore all of that, but also look for someone who they can partner with in terms of fundraising and get that kind of training and make those connections. So one thing that comes to mind is if I were faced with that, I'd probably reach out to Chamber of Commerce, for example, because they're always looking for ways to fundraise. Or again, you're probably, the type of fundraising that you're looking for is probably different than, membership and sales and that sort of thing. But it also could be that the Chamber of Commerce or the Economic Development or SBDC knows of a company that could mentor. So an example of this is Velco, which they're a transmission station or transmission company, and Velco has lots of resources available to them. And they make it a point to say to other employers that we are happy to help support. If there is a way that we can mentor or partner, I'm thinking of safety. They're willing to help mentor and support around safety trainings. So, and lots of small businesses get together, even with forklift training. A larger company may offer forklift training, and I know this is a little different than what you've described, but I think still a relevant example where smaller companies may not be able to afford to do a whole training or send someone away for an entire day. But there are other companies that are doing that training that will invite other companies to send their employees to that so that they can provide that level of support. So there are likely companies out there that could be a mentor and could help you also look at what are the significant things that you'd need to be looking at so that, again, you're gathering as much information, since this is not an area of expertise for yourself. You're gathering as much information as you possibly can so that you are having a relevant conversation with this individual as to whether they get trained, how they get trained, what resources are available to them, and then setting something up. Because now you're in partnership with one another and you don't have to promise anything. You're just going to have the conversation. But I would definitely reach out to other companies and network and find out, are there other people out there that can give you some information and provide some support? Good question. And it reminded me also of the grant writing. I had a client and grant writing was a big part of it. But finding someone who has grant writing experience, not easy to do. They were okay with that. They went into it knowing they likely weren't going to find someone with grant writing experience. They were interested in how the person would solve that problem, but they also had plans in place for getting the person trained and for making sure that the person at least had, fairly decent writing skills and, some sense of how would I go about it on my own first.
Two comments. One is, I think having owned businesses of my own too, and also run lots of businesses, including one in Europe for 7 years. A lot depends upon how related things are. I mean, I would have, if you were trying to hire a fundraiser, if somebody else had really strong, a candidate had really strong sales skills, marketing skills, writing skills, I'd probably take a chance if it was somebody who I thought had the right attitude and was willing to learn. Those are so related in what the actual abilities are. Whether you're skilled at it is one thing, but you have the ability is also the other. Also, you should all know this too. There is a program available through the state called the Lamoille Training Program, and they will pay under the right circumstances if your company is a good candidate. They will pay for up to 50% of the cost of training an existing employee or a new employee or employees. And there's legislation pending right now that is going to require the Vermont Training Program to concentrate their efforts more on smaller businesses, not big ones.
Excellent.
So that's a source of training funding that any company in the state can do.
And I've worked with the Vermont Training Program before. They are wonderful people to work with. It's a great resource that is not widely known. I'm really happy to hear that they're going to be working with smaller businesses. But they literally will walk you through everything. And they're wonderful help and so easy to work with. Yes?
Probably won't be able to answer this, but what's a typical timeline start to finish for a hiring process for, mid-level, like program manager? What's normal?
Is there anything normal in human resources and recruiting? I would have to say it runs the gamut. I mean, some of it's going to have to do with, the pool. I would say that the better you are on the front end of things with relationship building and just being out there and networking and that sort of thing, great. If it's a position, though, that they must come to the table with the skill, for example, an engineer. It is very hard to find an engineer in those situations. What I have done is I have contacted HR colleagues in larger companies and actually had great success. For example, when I was at Plasan, we had a hard time finding a manufacturing engineer. I called a colleague in a larger company that I knew was also recruiting for engineers, and I said, so, would you ask, your second and third pick to apply for our job? Send them our way. Tell them to give me a call. Hired 2. So get creative. There are other people around that are interviewing for very similar positions, and if you as a business owner know of someone that and it's a specific type of position, and I get that it's harder in a rural area, I would still reach out to other areas outside if it were one of those higher level positions. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. These were 2 students. They both graduated from UVM. They both came to work for us. They were willing to relocate. They were out of school. They didn't have any ties to the area, in terms of staying in the Burlington area. And if I hadn't made that phone call, I would have missed 2 engineers and somebody else would have gotten them. So again, it really is about networking. I would also look at, businesses that may be closing. And to John's point, sales, fundraising, applicable skills, it's thinking like that. And also just taking a stab at it sometimes. Sometimes it's, what is the downside of reaching out and finding out that, this isn't the fit? Not that individual, but that the skills over here don't transfer. But if you're hiring for attitude and you're training for skills, which most of us are in that situation for most of the positions, it doesn't matter where they're coming from. Look at your current employees. Sometimes we don't think that hiring family members or friends is a good idea because that can get us into difficulty. You know what? It's not a bad idea, because if you have a good work ethic, typically you may come from a family who also has that work ethic. We had a number of family members at Rutland Plywood and other places that we worked. Just know that you're going to have to, they can't report to one another. They may need to work in different departments, that sort of thing. Also, friends. If I'm a good worker, I'm probably hanging out with people who are good workers. I would contact your high schools. So, for example, and again, we're talking entry level. My greatest soapbox is that we don't spend a lot of time on the young people who are not going to continue their education. We have a large group of people. I think it's like 75%. Sounds ridiculously high, but I believe I'm right about this. Of the students who are seniors who say they're going to go on to college, 75% in one way or another either don't go anywhere in Rutland County, don't continue their education, continue part way, come back, go for 6 years, come back, and now they do not have the skill set for the work that we have available. So engaging with your local high schools, doing internships, training internships and partnering for success. That's a program that is available for employers. And it is taking a young person in high school and having them come into the workplace. Now, I know in manufacturing and some other areas we may have some difficulties, but it is being where the young people in our community are. And someone was saying before, how do you address this idea that there's no work and no viable jobs? We do it by pushing back. Here's the way I push back. I was at a family gathering, and the young woman was graduating from high school, and someone at the family gathering that I was sitting at the table with, who happened to be an educator, said, well, I can understand why young people are leaving, because there's nothing here. It sends me over the edge. But I didn't say anything then because it wasn't appropriate. And I actually saw them a few weeks later, and I said, wait, how are you? By the way, you made this comment. Here's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if you know about the Rutland Economic Development Corporation's website that specifically has jobs listed, livable wage and beyond, that there are like 100 unfilled jobs at that time. Do you know about that? Do you know about our Rutland Young Professionals and what they do? Do you know about Project Vision? Do you know about the Workforce Investment Board? And I listed off this huge laundry list of things that are actually going on in Rutland County. And I think that's what we as employers and just members of our community need to do. This year, at our sophomore summit, which we have in Rutland County, or this past year, we tied all of our career workshops and the individual careers to the McClure report, which is the highest paying, high demand, high paying jobs in the state. And we had profiles of all of our people who were presenters, and we tried to get younger people engaged, because what do we know? We know that if we develop a relationship with our young people and we let them know that we want you to come, we want you to know about what we do, and we actually have good jobs here, they will come. I will send the survey results from that last year's event. We moved the needle in a one-day experience of young people, sophomores in high school, who thought there was nothing there for them. We changed that with one encounter in one day. So we're pretty excited and pretty proud about it. So, to answer that question, we have to get the word out there that, we're kind of like Horton Hears a Who. We are here. we are here. We want you to be part of our workforce, and then take it that next step. And it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of work anyway. So any way you can be engaged in your high schools, any way you can be engaged your technical centers, your colleges, to let people know there are great jobs here. It's about relationship. You know, I'm looking, 5 minutes? I am looking at young people who now have a connection and who can actually see it happening because they see the young people who are in a variety of different industry sectors who are choosing either to move here or stay here, and what they like to do when they're not working. So there's a little...
But we all have to understand, too, is that the incredibly low unemployment rate in the state right now is not normal. It's not normal at all.
No,
and it is not in the state as well. It will go up. But while we're now all having to deal with it, we all have to be creative with basically what Teresa's been saying. But I also think the title of this workshop today is how to hire right the first time. And that means you've got to look at all opportunities, whatever they may be. But you also have to look at what you should be looking at. And I'll give you a really very short example. Janet Barbardier was the woman who ran the IBM plant in Essex Junction for years. And I remember her saying that when they were hiring for engineers for that plant, they were broadcasting this stuff all over the country. But they got to the point where they wouldn't even consider somebody for a job and move them here to work in engineering or some other high-level position if they had not spent some extended time living in someplace like Michigan or Alaska or Minnesota or whatever, because they had so many bad experiences with moving these people here. They go through one Vermont winter and they say, I'm out of here. So I give that as an example that you've got to be careful about who you're hiring as much as widening your net. You've got to be somewhere in the middle.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Sarah?
I just wanted to just throw one more thing out about the time frame question that you were talking about. Something that, when I think of when I'm doing, a lot of times I draw on like things that frustrated me when I was applying for jobs. And I think in terms of timing and how long something takes is look at where you are in that kind of calendar for the year, and kind of how, like, we had a job opening that came up around Thanksgiving, and we made a very intentional decision to wait until January to focus our advertising dollars and all of our efforts, because we knew that if we put an ad in on the 15th of December, how much time were staff going to be able to take to really, so you might be starting earlier, but you're just making the process even longer. So I think, or if you have, like, our fiscal year ends in September and the new one begins in October. So if you have things that you're doing that are going to take you away from, like what you're saying is really put all of your effort into doing that whole process, you might be turning candidates off by not being able to give them that attention. So sometimes that plays a part in how you might take longer to start, but you might finish quicker because you have the time.
One thing I have always done, and again, I know I worked for larger companies, but I think it still works for smaller companies as well. If you carve out every single week or every 2 weeks, whatever's the right process, for interviews and tours. And if you don't have any positions that you're hiring for, you're recapturing time. But if you do, everyone on the hiring team knows that on X day, every single week, from this time to this time, I am committed to interviewing. That will help move your process along. Also, I think, to Sarah's point, not only looking at your year and what you can manage comfortably so you don't lose people, but communicating that with the candidate as well so that they know what to expect in terms of timing. Because otherwise, it ends up being a really wonky, difficult process, but the more you can be systematic and predictable and control that, the better. I find that it's much harder to control it if you're then scrambling to find your interview times. Then you're bumping into people with vacations and so forth. So if you have a really well thought out questions in advance that everybody agrees upon. Times of the week or the month, depending on the situation, when you are actually carving the time out and dedicating it, and it is, you don't get to schedule anything else in here unless we cancel that. Those things will help you as well. So tell me more about your process for solving this sort of problem. I would ignore it for a week and likely discover that it wasn't important in the first place. If it still matters after a week, I would hold fake job interviews and ask someone how to solve it. Apparently that doesn't work. So you could do that, you know, to solve the fundraising challenge. So you have one job, interviewer. Keep your eye on the job. If you keep your eye on the job, then you are more likely than not going to have a good interview process. It's going to be what is upfront, and you're going to be much more proactive. So again, it's about the job, not the individual people. It's about the job first, and finding how to incorporate those transferable skills, the attitudinal fit that you're looking for, and just being really upfront, you know, and making sure that you're communicating with folks. And list of resources, again, I will send this to you. Scott had asked me a question about working with visas and so forth, which we didn't have time to delve into that today because that's a whole process in and of itself. But these resources I think you'll find very helpful. And there are some definite steps that you need to take, and you would want to, from what I'm reading and the experience that I've had with clients who've worked with visas, many who aren't doing this on a regular basis and don't have a process in place actually work with an attorney who advises you along the way as well. So last but not least, Willie invites you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and we look forward to seeing you there. Hiring is your most important task. There's nothing more important than hiring. So we want to make sure we attract and retain the right people. We want to be the Disney, right? That's what you want. You want to be the Disney of employers, meaning that you have people lined up at your door because they have heard about what a wonderful place it is to work. So thank you very much. We don't want to forget about our drawing. So.
Well, that's right. Before we do the drawing, two things. You all have evaluation sheets to fill out. Please fill those out and hand them to Charlie on the way out. That's your hall pass. That'll get you out of here, otherwise you'll get out of here. Secondly, we're always looking for new topics to cover for this is called the Business Skills Workshop Series. And we're always looking for new topics. If there's a particular topic that we haven't covered or you'd like us to cover, please write that on the back of that evaluation form. We do read those, and we do, where we can, if it makes sense, we do try to add those into our schedule. Charlie and I put together the schedule for every year, usually in October every year, and we get those scheduled for the whole next calendar year. Thanks very much.
And I will send the PowerPoint presentation along with the resources that will have live links in them. And if something does come up that you think, I might be able to help you with, feel free to email me. Happy to help in any way that I can.